Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Let's see. Just quickly want to say I'm really excited about this one. I met Will back in 2011, 2012, when he did a little artist residency at the Denver Art Museum with his photographic exchange project. So yeah, it still was impactful, and his work is still continuing to do so. So very excited. Thanks for coming. Will Wilson's art projects center around the continuation and transformation of customary indigenous cultural practice. He is a Diné photographer and a trans-customary artist who spent his formative years living on the Navajo Nation. Wilson studied photography, sculpture, and art history at the University of New Mexico, receiving his MFA in photography in 2002, and Oberlin College, receiving his BA in studio art and art history in 1993. In 2010, he was awarded the Joan Mitchell Foundation Award for sculpture. In 2016, the Pollock-Krasner Foundation Grant for photography. In 2017, the New Mexican Governor's Award for Excellence in the Arts. In 2021, the NDN Collective's Radical Grant and the Native Arts and Cultural Foundation Shift Fellowship. Wilson has taught at the Institute of American Indian Arts, Oberlin College, the University of Arizona. In 2020, Wilson was Doran Artist in Residence at the Yale University Art Gallery, and in 2022, a co-curator of Speaking with Light, Contemporary Indigenous Photography, a nationally touring exhibition. Wilson is program head of photography at the Santa Fe Community College, and with that, please give him a warm welcome.
Thanks so much, George, and thanks everybody for coming out and inviting me to come to Cranbrook. It's beautiful here. It's exciting to be able to learn about all your work, and tomorrow it'll be fun making tintypes. So I'm just going to kind of give a survey of my practice, but this isn't my photograph. It's an image that was shot in sometime in the mid-50s, I believe, and I just share it because it's still remarkable every time I see it to think about like how much change has occurred. I'm Diné. I'm also Irish and Welsh, but the young girl in the foreground is my mother, and it's just, sort of a visual indicator of how much transition has occurred in such a short amount of time, right? One generation. This was my mom, actually shortly before they came and took her to the boarding school, because up until then she had been hanging out at sheep camp with her mom and dad. But I imagine she's about 10 in this image. And there was an exchange with an editorial photographer, Ray Manley, who had this sort of this vision of I suppose, poverty on the Navajo Nation. But my family was pretty well off, by Diné or Navajo standards. And, so this kind of image was created in exchange with the folks. I think there was some money involved, and they wouldn't have drawn water from this roadside source. Like, they were well provisioned, and they were going to the trading post in Tuba City, Arizona. But yeah, it's just amazing for me to think about how much change has occurred in such a short amount of time. When I started doing photography, I actually started in a high school, and immediately fell in love with it. I grew up between San Francisco, California, and Tuba City on the Navajo Nation. And then when my parents split up when I was a kid, I moved back to the res with my mom. And one of the things that kind of made me so excited about the possibility of photography and storytelling that way was, I could express myself creatively. I'm not a fluent Diné speaker. So, and most of my family, my grandmother, for example, who's in this image, never spoke English. So, I was somewhat mute, I think, and photography enabled this sort of this pathway for self-expression. But early photography, kind of this documentary vision or style really appealed to me, and just the act of being working with chemistry in a dark room and going through the steps and the processes that it takes to make images fascinated me. So later, when I started going to college, I went to Oberlin College, and maybe became aware of some critical ideas in relation to photography and how perhaps photography had been used or sort of deployed as a tool of colonization, and thinking about my practice in relation to that history made it necessary for me anyway to transform the way that I was kind of sharing my work. And initially, my kind of answer to this conundrum about making images and sharing them of my family and friends on the reservation was to create installation and to sort of control the viewer's experience, right? So it's not just a simple reception of the work. You're sort of bound by structure and form, and you have to interact and hopefully have a little more of a stake in your relation to the imagery. So I ended up at the University of New Mexico. I chose going there because they had a particular interest in the history of photography, and that's always been sort of fascinating to me and important to me to think about the relation of my work and where to situate it in that history, I guess. So this is sort of a fast forward. In 2004, I started this series, actually. It's entitled Autoimmune Response. And I was thinking about sort of the environment and the history of extraction on the Navajo Nation and trying to figure out how to represent some of that and situate myself in it. And so I started to kind of perform the role of this protagonist figure in this narrative. That, I don't know, it's an ongoing thing. I haven't really fully resolved it. Most of the story kind of lies in the pictures, and I sort of let them speak for themselves in some ways. It's a little difficult to see, but there's a nuclear test cloud over in the far left of the image, and that's sort of this harbinger of change and transformation coming. I was also, I guess, thinking about the history of Western landscape photography and sort of these different layers of colonization that occurred. One term for the Navajo Nation is Diné Biketya. It just means you're related to this place and space. But that became colonial northern Spain in the state. In this continent, and then it became Mexico, and then it became the United States. And it, throughout that time, it's remained the Navajo Nation. But some of that early photography of the West, which was done in a process that you'll see I've been investigating for a while. Some of the first images of what's now the American West were done by these survey teams that were coming out to sort of explore this newfound territory. And, in many of those images, there's no evidence of people, even though there had been people there for, since time immemorial, we like to say. So the protagonist is trying to figure out what's gone on, why the environment has become toxic to him, and look for solutions. So autoimmune disease is sort of an indicator of, or is often associated with sort of sudden changes in environment, in foodways, and as a result, your own immune system is kind of triggered to fight itself. But this is a response, right? It's sort of about how do you exist in relation to what's going on and move forward. So he finds a hogan, which is a customary Navajo architectural form, and it becomes sort of a laboratory or site for kind of investigation. There's also reference to the creation story. There are these two twin hero figures, Born of Water and Monster Slayer, in the Navajo creation story that rid the world of monsters and enable it to be habitable for sort of this iteration of people. We're in the fifth world now. But in this kind of initial series of images, the protagonist ends up sort of fashioning a hogan of his own making in new materials. And so when you were experiencing the exhibition, you actually got to walk around in this architectural space and form, and then you were also surrounded by these rather large photographs, right? One of the reasons I was able to kind of produce that back in 2004 was my friend Josh Sarentitis and I had gotten a nice public art commission, and there happened to be an abandoned fire station in the neighborhood near the site of our mural. And so we transformed it into this amazing workshop kind of studio space. So these are kind of research images in relation to this project that I was undertaking. Weaving is an important customary form in Navajo culture historically and today. So later, as the story kind of unfolds, I was thinking about, well, what else would you need to survive in this apocalyptic space, and of course food. And so the hogan becomes a greenhouse, and there's different iterations of this. Air Lab is what I've been calling it. But there's this great organization in Tucson, Arizona called Native Seed Search. And they collect heirloom variety food species from the Southwest. And so I worked with that organization to kind of cultivate these cool species, and sort of thinking about them as technology that's suited for a space or an environment. And so this has, many forms. I just took it down. It was in an exhibition at the University Museum, the Utah Museum of Fine Art in Salt Lake, its last iteration. But I've also shown it at, this was the Denver Botanical Gardens, actually. They invited me to come up, and I used their facilities as sort of a backdrop to continue the narrative. This is a more direct response to how I was talking about sort of the history of, landscape photography survey that occurred when the United States became the owners of what is the Southwest. And so here I'm blending, actually, different technologies, the wet plate, the historic photographic process with digital, right? And I'm simply sort of trying to match the image on the ground glass of my large format camera, through live view over here. And that enables me to kind of bring them together rather seamlessly. So, this is an ongoing project. I've been doing it for almost 20 years now. I guess I tend to do these kind of long form projects. So this is a little bit of a spillover to a much more sort of documentary form of a project. This is not my photograph. It's an aerial image of the Church Rock uranium mill spill that occurred in 1979 in Church Rock, New Mexico. And it affected, primarily Navajo community members. There was a processing mill here, and a dam burst, and 93 million gallons of a sort of toxic radioactive slurry was spilled into the Rio Puerco, which is sort of a one of the feeder streams for the Little Colorado, which then flows through the reservation. Anyway, it's an ongoing problem and project. So I've been doing sort of a counter survey in some ways of abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation and like remediation in relation to that, right? With the drone photography, that tool has, particularly for like southwestern landscape photography, I think it's really enabled this whole other way to understand the land. This isn't my image. This is Joel Sternfeld's picture. But when I was a kid in Tuba City, this was like one of the few cool post-industrial kind of places to go and hang out and do like, adolescent things. And it's an abandoned uranium processing mill. And this is what it looked like when I was young. And, you can see the uranium tailings. And now it's a Superfund site. So it looks like this. So there are some of these major remediated sites, but there's over 500 abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation that have been identified. And, some of them are scheduled for remediation, but the half-life of uranium is like, 1 million years or something. The problem is not going to go away anytime soon. So I've sort of set out a challenge to myself to photograph them all. I'm working right now, sort of in the first 2 years of the project, on the western side, so between Flagstaff, Arizona, and Page. Highway 89 runs through there, and there's about 100 sites along that way, and that's closer to my home community, Tuba City, Arizona. But so, yeah, this is an ongoing project. I'm trying to sort of think about different ways that I can get the story out about this history. In the build up to like during the Manhattan Project, and then afterwards, the kind of building of the nuclear arsenal, a lot of the fissile material for that was sourced from the Navajo Nation. And unfortunately, they didn't tell people about how dangerous and how toxic the substance actually is, right? One other thing sort of that comes to mind when I see images like this is that, water is so important. Water literally is life out there because it's so arid. And when it does rain, everything's kind of drawn to the water. But so these depressions in the landscape then fill with water, but they're contaminated. And it's a very hot site, that one in particular. It was an upgrading facility. This is another site that's actually been remediated. You can see my pickup truck up in the top right-hand corner there. Again, like drone photography has just sort of transformed the possibilities of being able to image these sites. This is like a 60-acre remediated site. That's the former Mexican Hat uranium processing mill. And there was a little town here. There was a school there. And now it's, this Superfund remediated site. And then on the top, on the horizon, you can see Monument Valley, right? The kind of classic Western landscape. And then with the drone, I was, trying to figure out different ways to image this thing that's so fascinating to me. I keep going back to it. I noticed there was something out there in the field of little remediated river rock, and there was actually this monument, this plaque, to this remediation. And this is, it says that this is the Mexican Hat radioactive waste disposal cell, and there's 4,400,000 tons of material buried under this pile here. And there are other sites. This is at the Shiprock, the site of the former Shiprock uranium processing mill, and there's that sort of classic Western landscape again on the horizon. I've also used the drone to image the last sort of traditional processing mill in the United States. It's at White Mesa, and it's 2 miles upgrade from the Ute Mountain Reservation in southwestern Utah. And that's yellowcake floating on one of their sort of evaporative ponds. So, you know, the drone just enables like a sort of counter surveillance, the ability to do that kind of stuff. So this is sort of a documentary image of me out there in the land, but also sort of donning the garb of the autoimmune response protagonist. And then this is sort of the latest image from that series. And again, I'm doing that blend of historic and traditional processes, I guess, historic processes. I have a whole air force now of drones. I have bigger ones that enable me to carry a bigger payload so that I can, you know, make bigger images. The sort of prosumer drones are pretty constrained in terms of, you know, how big the sensor is. They're pretty small. If any of you are interested to learn more about this issue and how different people have sort of thought about addressing it, you know, from multiple perspectives. We're doing a speaker series through Diné College, which is the tribally run kind of university on the Navajo Nation. And this is, you know, this was much earlier. I think we have 6 or 7 people now who have, you know, joined this. And it's a resource. So it's meant to be there so that people can kind of look at this problem from a number of perspectives. But this is a little bit of a shift. I'm just going to kind of show you a lot of stuff that I've done. This is a big public art project. And this is why we had the Fire Station studio in Tucson, Arizona, Josh and I. This is actually a photograph comprised of 1 million pixels. And our pixel was a 3/4 inch square of Venetian glass tile. And so over the course of 3 years, we sort of developed the design in collaboration with the community, and then figured out how to produce it. And then we created it and installed it. We designed some software in order to help us map the pixels and sort of evenly distribute the production of this, you know, large-scale digital photograph, essentially, out of glass. This software is called TilePile. It's freeware. It enables you to sort of translate any image, really, into a grid, and then kind of know where and how to place the pixels. And we were working with an engineer who was trying to build a robot for us, but it kept breaking down because of the abrasive nature of the glass dust. And so this actually solved a big, well, it wasn't a problem. It was, you know, we made lemonade out of the situation, and it enabled us to bring in community volunteers, right? And so you could come in and you could produce one of the 12,000 square foot sections in about 15 minutes, right? And so it became like this way to engage community, outside of the fact that we spent a year in community designing the mural. You know, for example, there's Mr. Valenzuela, who's the mariachi teacher in Tucson at the local middle school, and then Dr. Laura Banks, who had to drop out of high school because she had a couple of kids, but then she went back, and then she eventually became the assistant superintendent of the Tucson Unified School District and was an important figure in sort of the history of desegregation in the schools in Tucson. She actually ended up being our keynote speaker, and Mr. V, he wrote a corrido for us that his group played for us. That's my collaborator, Josh Titus, who's, you know, a muralist who we met in Oberlin College and we're friends there. And ever since he's graduated, he's been making large-scale kind of public art. So just some other people in the community based on the neighborhood. Everybody in the mural had some deep connection to the site. So for a few years, we had a studio, and we competed for national public art calls. So this is in Phoenix at the Sky Harbor International Airport. This is in downtown Philly. This was sponsored by Lincoln Financial. It's another sort of million pixel project. And this is Tile Pile 2.0. We had a larger color palette that enabled us to make kind of nicer transitions. And so, I mentioned weaving before, and I had also wanted to weave a customary Diné textile. Excuse me. And so I used the technology that we developed to make the big mural piece to create a smaller work with a 4mm square of glass, right? And so this is based on a rug that my grandmother wove about 50 years now. And it's the same design except for the QR codes. And so when you engage those QR codes, you get this. Oops. This is about 2.5 minutes. So that was a conversation between my mom and an auntie of mine, and Margaret was telling my mom about this technique that actually, you end up with a two-faced rug, right? So the front and the back aren't necessarily the same. But I kind of ran with this idea. I made a few more textiles. This series of work is called Weaving the Sacred Mountains. There's 4 mountains that sort of define the traditional Navajo homeland. And each one has a color associated with it. So white is the east, blue is the south, yellow is the west, and then There's a black northern mountain. And then each of those QR codes, if you activate them, you're taken to a web-based video of sort of the protagonists doing their thing in those different sites. So because of time, I'm going to move past that. A different project and something we'll be doing tomorrow is this project. It's I guess this is the 11th year. This is called the Critical Indigenous Photographic Exchange. And I'm using a historic photographic process called wet plate collodion. Sort of the third photographic process. I think 1851 is the date. And I started it in 2012, and I did it actually during the Santa Fe Indian Market, which is this crazy event where like people descend on Santa Fe, and historically it's been sort of like a craft-oriented market, but it's totally transformed now into all kinds of interesting things and a festival going on. But sort of the world of contemporary indigenous art practice, at least based in the U.S., like shows up there. And it was a wonderful opportunity for me to be able to kind of start this project, capture images of people who are sort of important in the field, and just to share in sort of a dialogue around, the kind of history of photographic representation. I did kind of call out Edward Curtis and his North American Indian project as a sort of starting point, because I knew people would, be associated or understand that connection. But I hope that it moves beyond that kind of response to Curtis's practice. But it also has this interesting, I think, conversation with that body of work. He did this 30-year project where his aim was to photograph as many indigenous communities west of the Mississippi as possible before, Indians vanished, or before they became acculturated, in a way that sort of de-Indianized them or something. I don't know. Anyway, this is Joe Horsecapture, who's now at the Autry, but then he was at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and he saw the iPad there, and he said, "Hey, is that thing active?" And he pulled up this image, and that's Horsecapture, his great-great-great-grandfather, who was photographed by Edward Curtis. And he talked about in that image, Horsecapture has his rifle to represent his sort of warrior status, and then Joe was like, "Well, I'm a warrior around sort of culture and representation," and so he pulled that image up. Cara Romero, who's sort of blowing up right now in terms of her photographic practice. She's got a wonderful space in Santa Fe, and is a friend. Kevin Gover was then the director of the National Museum of the American Indian. Nick Galanin. I've been doing this project now for 13 years, and I've literally made thousands of these portraits of people. So the project is about exchange and what it means to kind of create portraits of people, and sort of have a dialogue about that. And one of the taglines is, "What if Indians invented photography? Like, would there be a different set of like practices and protocols in relation to, the making of an image of someone?" And so if we collaborate together on a project and make your portrait, you end up with the original photographic object, the tintype. They're usually 8x10. In exchange for giving me a scan and a non-exclusive license to sort of use that. So, it's also about reciprocity and hopefully generosity. Of late, I've been able to sort of enact something that I've always wondered or thought about, and that was to make the images come to life. So I have this app called Talking Tintypes, and we'll see if it works in here, but it's augmented reality, right? And so Like this is Madrine Salgado, who's the public relations director. She's an attorney for the Muckleshoot Nation up in around Seattle. And she decided to show up as a jingle dress dancer because that's kind of how she wanted to present herself. Carla plays the violin. Melissa Pochema does Princess Leia's speech to Obi-Wan Kenobi, except in this iteration, she does it to Popé, who led the Pueblo Revolt in 1680. So this is a bit of a departure. This is a collaboration with Adam McKinney, who is a professor of dance at Texas Christian University. And Adam's work is all about kind of like using his body and dance and performance to kind of work through traumatic histories and hopefully sort of activate healing and change in relation to those histories. When he moved to Texas, to Fort Worth, he started doing research about the history, the kind of racial politics and particularly violence that had occurred in that space. And he found the story of Mr. Fred Rouse. Mr. Fred Rouse was the victim of a racial terror murder or lynching in 1921. And Adam decided to sort of inhabit that kind of person and tale and story and reanimate it. He, did sort of deep research around the story. Mr. Rouse he worked in the meatpacking industry, and he wasn't invited to be part of the union, but he crossed a picket line and he knew there would be trouble, and he defended himself and eventually was overcome by a mob and murdered. But these are sites that are important to that story. And this one in particular is the sort of last large infrastructural, kind of purpose-built building of the KKK. It was actually Claver number 101. And it's 1012 North Main. I mean, that's, downtown Fort Worth right there. And actually, it's pretty amazing. He, in coalition with a number of organizations, including Mr. Rouse's family, have actually been able to raise funds and have purchased this structure and are going to transform it into a museum for sort of truth and reconciliation and healing through the arts. So these are also talking tintypes. So if you have the app, you can activate them. This is the site of his attack at this Swift and Armor meatpacking company. So he was overcome by the crowd, sort of beat within an inch of his life, and ended up at the hospital. A few days later, a white mob came and kidnapped him from this site, and they hung him at this site, which is, it used to be a tree there called the Death Tree. 100 years to the day, Adam, in coalition with a number of different organizations, they actually bought this site and they broke ground with the Fort Worth City Council on the Fred Rouse Memorial Park. And it's pretty amazing. Fred Rouse III, who didn't even know this story of this thing that had happened to his great-grandfather, he gave like an incredible, rousing keynote address. And it's cool to be just a small part of this sort of project. But Adam, in coalition with folks, the Tarrant County, what is it called? The Tarrant County Coalition for Peace and Justice, which is associated with the larger kind of peace and justice institution, was able to kind of, transform these sites. This is sort of an animation. This is what you will experience if you have the app. So each one of those sites is sort of activated, and Adam does different choreography. And I'm going to talk briefly here a little bit about sort of curatorial practice in relation to what I do too. It's sort of unfortunately still at this place, although a lot has changed in about 20 years, where sort of advocating for the exhibition of contemporary Indigenous art and the study of it sort of had to come from within, and we had to kind of create a platform for our own work. This is an earlier version of sort of that work. I was the project manager for something called the Vision Project, which lived at the Museum of Contemporary Native Art in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And we profiled the work of 60 Indigenous artists, and we commissioned 20 different Indigenous writers to sort of engage this. And it was sort of modeled after the sort of P for photography, or, this kind of encyclopedic kind of surveys. But much more recently, I co-curated this exhibition that just closed in Fort Worth and is going to open in Denver next week. Unfortunately, it's not going to go to the Museum of Fine Art in Boston. But as part of that project, there's about 35 contemporary Indigenous photographers in this work. And I do have one piece in the show in sort of the prelude area that's a nod to this history of what is known as delegation photography, when in different Indigenous communities were sort of sitting down at the treaty-making table in D.C., and it really is sort of like the foundational moment for Indigenous sovereignty in the United States, at least in relation to the U.S. This work is sort of a survey from the late '80s until now of different folks and their practices, that was a really exciting, interesting project. My co-curator on it was John Rohrbach, who's the senior curator of photographs at the Amon Carter. But if you get a chance, I know you guys are going to Denver, check it out. I'll be there in March too, I think March 2nd. But yeah, what else? I think I'm almost at the end here. This is much more recent stuff. I've sort of made the connection between the history of land art in the Western American landscape and these crazy sites, these remediation sites. And I've shot Spiral Jetty and what's his name? Over there. Terrell, yeah, James Terrell's Rodin Crater. I still have to get Nancy Holt's Sun Tunnels, and that's Di Maria's Las Vegas project. I'm not sure if that's going to stay in there. I'm going to try and get an image of the lightning fields. And this just came down. This was at the Southeastern Center for Contemporary Art, and it was sort of a mid-career retrospective that profiled a lot of these different projects. This is the latest iteration of the Air Lab, the Autoimmune Response Laboratory. And in this case, a lot of different things are intersecting, right? Again, the greenhouse, looking at species that actually bioremediate. They can pull heavy metals out of the earth as a potential solution. And then just, a site to learn about the history of uranium extraction and processing on the Navajo Nation. But with that, thank you very much. That's the end of my slideshow. And I'm happy to address any questions or I know that's a lot. A lot of stuff in a lot of different directions.
I've been really interested in this. Thank you, William, by the way.
Oh,
It's been
sure.
super extensive how far you've gone since I briefly met you back in 2012. But this word remediation
Uh-huh.
has been really like curious to me about like how it kind of even starts to connect with your, I guess, photographic background and practice of trying to like not necessarily troll Edward S. Curtis, but more kind of try to extract what was actually in those images that were being created. And I wonder if like that's a mode of trying to kind of tease that out a little bit more with all the projects that you've been kind of continuously doing. But yeah, I wonder if that's like a thought that's crossed your mind or not. But I'm just like kind of making these connections between all these projects and in that word specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of Edward Curtis, at least 10 years ago, if you mentioned Indigenous photography, I think in a lot of people's minds, that's what kind of pops up in sort of the imaginary of most folks who are exposed to that work. And then sort of seeing my practice as a response to that, like framing it that way, was very strategic. Like I knew his 150th anniversary was around the corner. And of course, like, in the present day, there are these beautiful collections of work and people want to show them, but they're going to require an Indigenous response, right? And so I was sort of setting myself up for that. And, I do, like genuinely, I'm interested in that. But I also think that project hopefully has covers other ground, or maybe it's important to have sort of a thing to respond to as an entrance point and then see what directions are possible, as you're in the practice of making the work. But I mean, this project with the drone photography of the abandoned uranium mines really did sort of like begin with that much more, I don't know what to call it, like a self-performative kind of way to engage with the landscape, which is that autoimmune response work, right? I guess I don't know. I'm happy when sort of work shows me the next direction to move in, but I'm not sure if that answered your question, but
No, it totally does. Yeah, it's just like it's great to see the stepping stones with each project, and obviously me as an audience and a student here, it's great to kind of see those like interwoven kind of connectiveness through all these projects.
Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to ask you how you think about balancing, like educating a public about a history or like the uranium sites, and like how do you think about like that and how it balances with like your own artistic expression, or like what sort of responsibility do you consider in that, and what responsibilities does the viewer have? How does that all balance out for you?
yeah, I mean that's a really good question. I think I've always had an interest in sort of the relationship, I guess, between ethics and aesthetics, and feeling like it's important to me to I don't know, sort of a cheesy expression, but like leave the world in a better place than when I found it, or the situation. But then, using that as a real sort of foundation for the practice, figuring out like how I can best like use the skills that I have to work with other folks, because it's usually a collaborative thing that I'm doing, to sort of join the fray in figuring out the solution. I mean, that's something that I've said a lot, is like artists are remarkably, good at imagining like solutions to complex problems, you know. And I think like if you're gonna, you know, even if it's like public policy or something, you should definitely bring artists on board to help figure out that, you know, sort of process of visioning for a solution, or, you know, and maybe it'll go that direction or maybe not, but I think it certainly can't hurt. And yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of these projects have the potential of just being extractive, but I definitely want to like give back or like figure out how I can work with other folks. You know, like I was really excited about the opportunity to do that work in collaboration with Diné College. You know, and I think that's like the public that like potentially really needs to know about this issue and also can help address it. You know. And I think inspiring, you know, young Diné art students, like with the possibility that, you know, you could build a practice around potentially addressing some of these issues is exciting to me. You know, it's not something that I was particularly exposed to when I was going to school, but I don't know, my friend Josh Sarentitis has been doing this community-based public art for years and years and years. I think that collaboration around that project really taught me a lot and got me excited about the power or the potential of sort of working in collaboration or in coalition with communities.
Thank you.
Okay. So tomorrow we'll be making tintypes. If anybody wants to see the process, it's really fun. It's really magical. I mean, it's such a departure from click with your phone. But sure.
You have a lot of projects going on at one time, and it's very impressive, but also they seem to be very long projects, all of them. Like, how do you organize all of that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you're looking at like almost 35 years of work. So I'm like handing it, you know, it's not like I did this yesterday. But there's a bit of a juggling act that goes on. I mean, I've always tried to like teaching is sort of my bread and butter, and you know, it always sort of revolves around that teaching schedule. But I don't know. You know, there's these moments where I do have like serious anxiety about like pulling off stuff, but then I don't know. I'll go for a run or like, you know, spend some time in the darkroom, and I'm just like, I'm like living in the dream, you know, I should not be anxious about this, and it's going to happen because I'm going to make it happen. I don't know. In those moments, it's definitely like I got to talk myself down a little bit and be like, all right, let's just like make this happen and be honest with people. And, you know, I don't know. I think people are usually pretty generous. And collaboration too is really important. Like getting help or like working with other people is, like this was an amazing opportunity to work with a curator who was very sort of interested in connecting people. And, you know, like I wasn't initially planning on growing this stuff, or I didn't know much about that process, but Whitney Tassie, who was the curator there, put me in touch with all of these people at the sort of research greenhouses, you know, and they were working on phytoremediation. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And they took really good care of those plants. And the hardest part was to actually get through the registrar. And, you know, they had a staff of people making sure there weren't like bugs on the plants and stuff. And I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
What was this? Oh. And to kind of add on to Amelia's question, because you had asked me this during our studio visit, how do you know when you're done with a project?
That's a good question. I was asking you because I don't know. I was like, trying to learn something. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like these projects just keep going, they kind of evolve into the next thing. I mean, that's sort of a knock, like curatorially. I've heard a lot of people saying, oh, you're still doing that project? Like, in an industry that I think sort of thrives on like new stuff and new ideas that are, it's like, oh, you're still doing that? Like, I just have to say, yeah, I am. And it's evolved. But yeah, I mean, that is, I think that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of production too, because I'm doing the same thing over and over again and I know how to do it, and I really trust that. And so I can, just sort of add on to it. I'm interested to hear what you all think about this kind of comparison. Yeah. I was trying to find like a good, I really love Terrell's installations and I've experienced them and I imagine this thing is just going to be phenomenal. But I also felt like really, it was interesting because I was out shooting uranium mines and I realized I was very close to the Roden crater. And so I used my drone to help me find how to get there. Because that's something else that drones are really cool for if you're out in the landscape. Because, you might drive down a road for 20 minutes and it just dead ends or it's like cliff, but if you send the drone up, then you can kind of see the route to take. And it turns out that, that land Terrell bought butts up against the Navajo Nation. And there's this really nice fence that you don't usually see out there. But it clearly demarcates his Roden crater space and then the Navajo Nation. So I felt like I was sort of counting coup on Terrell because I was standing on my side of the fence and I just sent the drone up, and I was like, I'm going to take pictures of your secret master plan art project. But yeah, that's recent. I mean, that's maybe a year old, that picture. So, and I mean, our Western Sacred Mountain is right behind it. That's what's on the horizon, So I think that was another thing that I was particularly interested in, just these really important sites for all kinds of reasons, and then how close these other sort of interventions on the land are in relation to them. Yeah, because I don't want it to just be oh, land art bad, because there is something amazing about these structures, even though they have this really sort of dark and toxic history. They're totally beautiful. Yeah. Maybe I could get a grant to redo Spiral Jetty on the drive a bulldozer out there. Be yeah. I think it's great that you brought me out here and that you're going to get to go see Speaking with Light in Denver. That's really cool. There's a lot of great work in that exhibition. And I haven't seen how they're going to lay it out yet, but that was a very interesting process. They cut a ton of our text, So at the Amon Carter, we were limited to 150 words for an extended label. And at Denver, since everything's also in Spanish, they're bilingual, we had 75 words. So we had to we had already felt like we were trimming everything possible. And it was oh God, no more words.
Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. And thanks, Will.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Fun.